Hi, everybody. Welcome to Unit 3 Ecosystems, where we're today talking about Lesson 1, but we're looking at the second part of Lesson number 1, where we're going to look at Investigation 1 and Investigation 2 and generate some initial ideas regarding some population and community dynamics. As we think back to part 1 of lesson 1, we generated a bunch of questions. We had this very small piece of information about buffalo populations over a 15-year window between 1960 and 1975. We have some really great questions about what happened before that time period, what happened after that time period, what happened to other organisms or in the ecosystem to cause that change. Did that change cause changes in other species? Really, really great questions. So, where are we going to take all of those questions and where are we going to go from there? We need to be able to know some stuff about the Serengeti, right? We have some ideas about it, but we're going to need to discover a little bit more information and in order to investigate those causes for changes in those populations. So, we're going to watch this little short video, and in this short video, part 1 and then part 2, you're making some observations. Of course, the obvious observation are about the types of animals that we see, but you can also look at the surroundings of those animals. So as you make observations, you should be looking to see what you see, but as scientists, we should also always be asking questions. And so for this activity, we made our observations, but we also asked an additional question based on what we saw. In investigation 1, we looked at Google Earth, and we also looked at a data set of photo capture, right? So the photo capture would be like game cameras that are set up in different areas of the Serengeti National Park, where as animals move by, motion detecting software would kind of trigger the camera to take a shot, a capture of the organisms. And from that, we were able to get some data as to different numbers of different species in that area that show up on those cameras. So when we're looking at, and then of course we're going to answer some questions about what the climate would be like based on where it is, some questions about which types of species do we find. So let's look at the first couple questions where we're asking about the climate, what we expect the climate to be back based on where the Serengeti is. What do we expect? So if we look at the Serengeti National Park, it's in Tanzania. And if we look at a screenshot, we do some Google Earth things, we can see that it's a lot of open grassland with some rock outcroppings, some trees, some bush areas. For the most part is open grassland. If we look at a larger Google Earth, we see that it's very close to some desert areas. And because it's in Central Africa, we're going to kind of realize that that's closer to the equator, and we would predict our climate to be warmer climate. We expect it to be more of the same similar types of temperatures all year, not the big changes in temperature that we get much more north or south of the equator, like Michigan, for example. I don't think they get many snow days in the Serengeti. Other set of data is this is really one long set of data that they kind of cut in half and moved over. And in your questions, you were asked to identify from this data, just this data, 6 species that have the highest populations. And we noticed that, and then from that, we're supposed to find some identifying features, right? The next question is, what are 2 things these things have in common? Well, if we look at if we look at these species, we have our buffalo, we have elephant, which has a population over 10,000. We have hartebeest, which is a very long-nosed, hooved animal. We have wildebeest at 100,000. Zebra at 70,000. And Thompson gazelles at 40,000. So all of these guys have the populations above 10,000 or more, with wildebeest being even more than that at 100,000. What are some identifying features of these guys? If you noticed that they're all herbivores, great observation, they are all herbivores. Some other observations are that they are also larger species. We noticed, a lot of them noticed that they are prey animals for other organisms. Some people noticed that these are animals that travel in herds. And some of us noticed that these may also be animals that move long distances across the grasslands. From this, we looked at our other data. The next question asked us to look at predators. And if we look at some of the predators, we have things like the caracals, which are a small African wildcat. We have our cheetahs and our civets. All of these are cats of the feline family. We have other, like the jackal, which looks very similar to a coyote in the canine family. We have leopards. We have split into two sets of data: lions, males, and females and males. And we have servals, again, some more cats, lots of felines in the African Serengeti National Park. Then we have our hyenas, right? And then we have, for example, wildcats. So if we look at these guys right here, what are some observations, right? We were looking at the numbers of these herbivores, these large herding herbivores, and the predators that potentially eat them. If you notice in the numbers, there's a big difference in numbers, where all of the herbivores are 10,000, right? Anywhere between 10,000 to 100,000 in population, there are much fewer predators. In one of our classes, the number 1/10, they said, "Oh, Mrs. Pickard, there's about 1/10 of the predators." They noticed that where a lot of them were in the thousands, right around 10,000, that the predators were around 1,000. And so they said, oh, it's about 1/10 or 10% of the population. So you guys made some really great observations. From this overall data, we were kind of making some observations about biodiversity, bio meaning life, and diversity, of course, meaning variation. And from this data, it suggests that there is quite a bit of biodiversity in the African Serengeti, in Africa, in the Serengeti National Park. And these are all larger animals, of course. So this is even counting insects and reptiles and smaller, much smaller organisms, or even, not very many birds are even listed in here. So, of course, we expect there to even be even more biodiversity as well. As we look at the next set of data that we're using for investigation 2, we have a 5-paragraph section of text. And we're going to chunk that text up. By looking at each paragraph, we're going to pull out the main idea of each text. So in chunk 1, we're really talking about the diversity. We're talking about the number of species, what the Serengeti is, right? So, and its overall size. So again, what we say the main idea of this paragraph is that the Serengeti National Park is a large park with lots of diverse habitats and wildlife, and also millions of herbivores and thousands of predators. Chunk 2, we're looking at where it's located and its regions. In chunk 3, it's talking about the different zones and some of the different ecosystems that lie within it. What do you find to the north, to the south? What species you're more likely to find in some places than others. Chunk 4, talking about the climate, talking about the rainy season versus the dry season, and some other factors that go in with that abiotic factor of rainfall and precipitation. In chunk 5, we're talking about migration. It's talking about the movement of those large herbivores north and south, and also talking about the predators as well. Taking that information, what we expect to find with different habitats, we were making some sense from those texts. So question 16, you were going to use the information to label the map. So What's the migration, right? Where is the species hang out in the spring? Where do they go in the winter seasons? Then, knowing that in ecology, in ecosystem science, that a landscape refers to interacting ecosystems together. So when you describe the landscape of the Serengeti, go back to the reading, you're going to look for what are the different varieties of ecosystems that are there. And this is the really important one. This is where, at the end of it, we're looking for the understanding. So question 18, what can we conclude, right? What can we put together about the biodiversity and concentration of different species in the Serengeti? And in our text, it asks us to cite two sets of evidence. Of course, we have two sets of evidence today. We have the photo capture data, and we have the chunked reading. Now, biodiversity and concentration both refer to numbers of animals, but they are not the same data point. So when we're making our conclusion about biodiversity, we should be making a conclusion about the number of species, the variety. Biodiversity is about the amount of variety present in an ecosystem, where concentration refers to the number of each species in that area. So again, biodiversity is the variety of species. High biodiversity means lots of different species. Low biodiversity means very few different individual species. When we talk about concentration, we're talking about numbers. So if we're looking at a species, we're saying, is there a lot of that species in this area, right? In this park, is there a lot of that organism in this area, in this small area or in this large area? Or are there very few? So we're looking at the numbers within that. So your responsibility is to use the data and tell me as the teacher, what do you think? What do we know about the biodiversity, the variety of species, and the number, the concentration or the number of those species present inside the Serengeti? As we move forward into lesson 2, think about where do you think we're going from here? And as scientists, we should always be saying, all right, we learned some new stuff. So now what new questions do we have? We're going to be thinking about how we can keep track of our findings throughout the unit. Of course, we're using our incremental modeling tracker. So we've used the last few units. So we're going to do some more investigation. We're going to be looking at the buffaloes and their interaction with their ecosystem, talking about what they eat and figuring out, since many of us hypothesized that it was because of food availability that there was an increase in population, we're going to explore that possible hypothesis that it is food that has to do with the increase in population. All right. So if you want to know the answer to these questions, you got to meet me over in lesson 2.